And I'm Marcus Rosati.
And this is Passport Necessary, a podcast dedicated to talking about being a TCK when we were kids and now how it affects us as we have grown up. And today we're going to get into a very fun topic that I have been excited about. And we've kind of touched upon in previous episodes. It's UK terms versus US terms. Now, being more specific, it's terms that are different between the two countries. So even though we are both English-speaking countries as a majority, what are terms that we use that are different or have a different meaning in both countries? So Marcus, do you want to start off with one of your favorite terms?
Well, it probably sounds. I'll start off with this one. It probably sounds a bit rude, but the thing is, it actually technically isn't. There's a term in Britain which is a cock up, which is basically means that you've done something wrong. It's gone wrong. It hasn't gone the way you wanted to do. It's a mistake. And basically, where the term comes from, there's going to be a few archery terms in this. Actually, I think. It basically comes from the idea is on an arrow you have the 3 flights on the arrow, which is the feathers that go at the end, and they're basically set so that you have 3 around the back of the shaft of the arrow. And normally, what you would do is that the part of the shaft that passes the arrow has to have 2 flights that face they basically form a third of the back of the arrow. So they're set equidistant from each other. So basically, when you pull the arrow back as you're stringing the bow, the flights of the arrow should basically be perfectly capable of passing the bow itself. So you'd have the 2 parts of the flights. That's the normal way you would release. If you were to turn the bow around so that there was one of the flights that basically was sitting, basically pointing directly at the bow, basically parallel to the ground, as you pull that back and release it, what would happen is the arrow would shoot off in a direction you didn't want it to because the flights are passing the bow. And that's what a cock-up is.
Yeah.
It's basically because the arrow shoots off in the wrong direction because the arrow has been placed on the bow in the wrong way. And that's where the term comes from.
Yeah, I did archery briefly when I was in high school, and that was always
Yes.
something we were constantly repeated at was check your arrow. Are the 2 are the 2 feathers, are they pointing towards your bow so that they're not going to hit it? Or is the one feather pointing at your bow so it's going to hit it and you're going to miss aim?
Yes.
That's interesting. I didn't know that's where that came from.
Yeah, that's where it comes from.
Yeah, in the US, we would not use that. I mean, if someone did, we would be like, who are you trying to impress? Like, are you fancy? Like, no one would use that. You would say, like, I messed up or I effed up. Like, it wouldn't be very, like, like a cock up sounds a lot more posh, kind of. At least for Americans, it would be.
Well, it's interesting that it would be considered to be that because the thing is that the bow is essentially a poor man's weapon in a sense. Basically, because the English armies in the Middle Ages would be using bows because what it meant is that you could basically pay people very little. They wouldn't have to have a huge amount of equipment that was exceedingly expensive. So the thing is, you could get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these people on the ground, and they were generally peasants or people who came from peasant backgrounds. So it's interesting that it's sort of like it becomes something that's more considered to be posh in the US and something that's considered essentially quite colloquial or comes from a very sort of lower class background as a term, because obviously medieval knights probably wouldn't have been using bows generally speaking unless they were going hunting.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's also not considered posh in the UK, is that archery was used for hunting, which, I mean, it was definitely used for hunting here in the States too, but we moved away from that pretty quickly, whereas I think that the UK has a far longer history when it comes to archery and using it as both a weapon and also as a tool to survive.
Yeah, I mean, particularly as a weapon, it sort of like sits in our history as a sort of an idea of basically beating the French and the Scots, to be honest. It is genuinely the first real time that the longbow was used by an English monarch against an army he wanted to defeat was against the Scots. It wasn't against the French.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's moving off topic slightly, but yeah, that's
No.
as far as I understand it, that's the history.
I have one. I think it's good.
Yeah.
In the UK, there is a term for touch wood, like to touch wood.
Yeah.
Whereas in the US, we would say to knock on wood, which both mean the same
Okay.
thing. It means like knock on wood, like hopefully this will happen. So if you say
Yeah.
something like, oh, I hope I get that job, knock on wood. So it's like, hopefully that will happen. And it comes from an old term that basically there was a belief that there would be spirits in the wood. And so when you would cut the wood down, the spirits still lived within the wood and they might be angry that you cut their tree down. And so they might be vengeful spirits. So if you said important things around them, they could make it so that it wouldn't happen. But if you knocked on the wood, you would confuse them enough that they would forget the information that you just gave them. Isn't that interesting?
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. See, the thing is in Britain, in the context, if you say touch wood, what it means is you hope the bad thing won't happen.
Yeah.
So you'll say, it's like, you know, it's something, it's more, you wouldn't say, I hope I get the job, touch wood, as such. I mean, you might do, but you probably might say, you know, it's like, well, something like,
I hope I don't get injured.
yeah, I don't hope I don't get injured, touch wood. I hope I don't get COVID, touch wood. That sort of thing. That you tend to be warding off something rather than bringing something towards you more often. That's how I hear it more often. That could be my own personal experience of the phrase.
Interesting.
But it does tend to be more. I often hear it more in a sense of trying to ward off something negative happening rather than hoping that something good will happen.
I will be honest.
You can do both, but.
I will be honest, when I first saw that term, like the English term touch wood, my mind immediately went, well, that sounds dirty. Because in the US, like knock on wood is a lot more like I'm knocking on it. Yeah. Whereas touch wood, I was like, ooh, that's an interesting term we would not use in the States.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm sure there's a website about that somewhere.
Oh my gosh. Okay, Marcus. What's the term that you have that you like?
Well, it's a bit of a strange one. It's one that people don't seem to fully know the meaning of, and it has a bit of a dark history. Mm-hmm. But people often say something, you know, sweet FA. Mm-hmm. People think it means sweet F all. That's not what it means. It comes from, I cannot remember the exact century, but either it comes from the 1700s or the 1800s. And what happened was that there was a girl who was murdered, and her name was Fanny Adams. And she was murdered by a lawyer, as far as I remember. And what he did was he cut her body into bits, and that's how she was discovered, is basically in pieces. And the thing was, at the same time, this is a very famous story because there's a really, really big crime that was committed. And at the time, sailors in the Navy were given tins of rationed meat, and the meat was said, they told people it was mutton. But because it was so disgusting and nobody knew exactly what it was, they suggested that it was Fanny Adams that had been cut up and put into the tin. It might as well have been her. And so the phrase "sweet FA" came to be basically it's sweet Fanny Adams, meaning it's worth nothing. It's, you know, it's a worthless thing because it's, you know, it could be anything. It's a really strange term, and a lot of people think it means something else, but it's actually probably more horrible.
Yeah, that's really dark. I also took a chance to look it up, and it said that it happened in 1867.
Okay, so later than I remember. But I mean, I suppose that makes sense because, you know, if it's tinned food, they did start using tins later on.
Yeah,
but
that's so
that's where
dark.
It comes from.
Oh my gosh.
As far as I remember, it's definitely true. I think it was one of Lucy. There's a historian who makes documentaries in the UK called Lucy Worsley, and she did one about crimes, and she mentioned this specifically because it's one of these terms that comes up that is a bit strange and unusual, and people do use it. They don't use it that often anymore, but people do say sweet FA. But it means something different to what people think it means.
Interesting. I have a different one. I found that entree versus an appetizer has slightly different meanings based on the country. So in the US, the first dish that you get, like if you're starting the meal, we would call it an appetizer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was looking it up online, there was like a couple different places I looked up, and one or two websites said that in the UK, the first dish that you would get at the start of a meal would be called an entree.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, like we would call it like the main course. For
Yes.
us, the main course, what in the UK you would call a main course, we
Mm-hmm.
would call it an entree. So I thought that was interesting
Right.
how like entree has a slightly different meaning based on the country. Do you still use entree in the UK?
Normally, when you would see something that would be considered to be an appetizer or something like that in a restaurant, it's generally referred to as a starter.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have like starters, main, dessert.
Mm-hmm.
That tends to be the way it's done. Um, I haven't ever seen entree on a menu, but it might exist. Appetizer does exist on a menu now and again,
Mm-hmm.
but it's often referred to as a starter.
Interesting.
Um, I'm assuming because in Britain often takes things from France because obviously it's very close, and the French are considered to be sophisticated in Britain, so because they are. Um, so I think a lot of it is probable that it does exist in certain restaurants or certain places. I've never personally seen it, but I wouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
surprised if it existed.
Right. In the US, we would say appetizer, entree, dessert. Like that would be the
Mhm.
order that you would see it on menus. I just thought that
Okay.
was really interesting because it seems to be pretty unique to the States that we call it an appetizer. Um,
Mhm.
it doesn't really show up anywhere else. Um, and then another term that I know we talked about before, and I thought it was really funny because we got into a whole debate about it, was in the UK, what you call custard, we would call pudding. But in the
Oh
UK,
yeah.
calling something a pudding can kind of generally refer to dessert, but it usually
Yes.
refers to a steamed, bready mix.
Yeah. So I
Like,
think
I think that's such an interesting layer of all these different things.
yeah, I think this kind of almost becomes a north-south thing in England,
Okay.
particularly in England. Um, in the south of England, you refer to it as a dessert.
Mm-hmm.
So that's your last course, which would be your sweet thing. This is particularly talking about in courses in a meal.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes in the north of England, they'll refer to it as pudding. They don't refer to it as dessert. They refer to it as pudding.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a thing of like, pudding is a kind of, generally speaking, a bready type thing. It'll be steamed or something like that. That tends to be the case. But it does also refer to in the north of England as a course. And the other thing that's different is that in the south you have breakfast, lunch, dinner.
Mm-hmm.
In the north of England, it would be breakfast, dinner, tea.
Mm.
That's how they refer to it. And that's always confused me. I have no idea why they do it, and I don't know why the difference exists, but it does exist. And it's just very clear. You can tell someone, even if their accents are very close to each other, because, I mean, there are people who have very sort of accents a little bit like mine, sort of like BBC type accents, who'll refer to meals in the day in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And they will refer to it in the South more usually as being breakfast, lunch, dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas it will often be referred to in the North as breakfast, dinner, tea, as
Interesting.
far as I remember.
And then is there also supper, or is that not a thing?
Not so many people use that word anymore. I haven't heard anybody use that for a long time.
Because supper comes from the French term souper,
Mhm.
which basically came from, they kind of adopted the idea of tea.
Yeah.
Well, doing a tea time, but having like a mid afternoon kind of like snacky
Mhm.
thing. But that's far more common in the UK. So the English took that term, souper, and they
Mhm.
turned it into supper. And so
Mhm.
this was more for like middle upper class. They would have breakfast,
Yeah.
they would have lunch, they would have tea, which would be around like 4 or 5 o'clock. And you're not really hungry around 8,
Yeah.
9 o'clock because you ate like 4 hours before.
Yeah.
But just so you didn't go to bed like starving hungry, you would have souper, which would very often actually be a soup. Like you very often would have something light,
Okay.
not too heavy, so you could go to bed feeling full but not stuffed. So
Mm.
that's why that term supper became more
That's interesting.
used. And I don't think it's really used anymore because no one really has 4 courses in a day like they used to.
No.
I don't
It,
think
it,
it's
it
very common.
No, I think, if somebody uses the word supper, you normally think it probably comes from something pre-World War II. You would
Mm.
assume that that's what's going on. It appears in literature a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You see people referring to it as a supper
Yep, and that's where it's
and that
from.
kind of
It's a
thing.
French
Yeah.
term. I remember when I
Well,
read that, I was like, yes.
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, because it
Absolutely.
does. English people, I mean, they do use French terms a lot. I mean, there are even people who won't, because oftentimes you hear people say restaurant,
Mm-hmm.
pronouncing the T at the end. If you're posh, you go restaurant.
Yeah,
You
because
pronounce
that's
it more
far
like a French
closer to
person would.
French. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also saw that there are a lot of foods that are more closely referred to with the French name rather than the American
Hmm.
version of it. So like
Oh yeah.
aubergine, an
Yes.
aubergine instead of what we in the States would call an eggplant.
Eggplant.
There's also the same thing with courgettes. They're called
Yes.
courgettes in England, but in the States we would call them zucchini.
Yeah.
So it's just I think that the Brits, because they were invaded by the French for so long, they just used a lot more cooking terms that come from French
Yes.
style of cooking, and they kept it. Whereas in the US, we
Mm.
were like, we don't want anything to do with the US or France. We're going to use our own words. And it's like, okay, whatever.
So they went
It
to the
doesn't matter.
Italians.
Yeah, they went for the Italians. I actually didn't understand why eggplants were called eggplants for the longest time.
Hmm.
And then fairly recently, I saw a photo of a white eggplant, like a small white
Right.
eggplant on the plant, and it really does look like an egg. It truly looks like an egg.
Okay.
So I was like, oh, so if you had a white one, I could see why you would call it an eggplant.
Yeah, that
But
makes
before
sense.
that, I was like, how did that term even come up? And now I know. You do one. You do one.
Um. Well, a fun one that they say in Britain quite a lot is dodgy. If something's
Mm-hmm.
dodgy, that's a good one. Um, you can refer to a person as being a bit dodgy, and it kind of suggests that they're probably vaguely criminal. That's generally speaking what it kind of refers to. If somebody's dodgy, it means that they're untrustworthy, unreliable, possibly a little bit dangerous. That sort
Mm-hmm.
of thing. It's that sort of thing. It's not a good thing at all. It's never used in a good way. I mean, the other thing is you can say that a piece of building is dodgy,
Mm-hmm.
um, dodgy workmanship, or the situation's a bit dodgy or whatever. It's used to describe a situation as being not good. There's
Right.
something wrong. You know.
Yeah, I think in the States, the closest we would have for a person would be suspicious. Like, oh, that person's very
Mm.
suspicious. But it doesn't have the connotation of danger to it.
Yeah.
Um, the only other terms I think of are like more within an explicative, like, oh man, that's fucked up, or like, oh, I
Yeah.
wouldn't trust
Yeah.
that. But it would be more like, I don't trust it, or it's
Hmm.
suspicious. But we don't really have a term that says that. And if an American were to say, like, oh, that's dodgy, you would be like,
Yeah.
yeah, what are you trying to be English? Like, what? Like it's so English within an American viewpoint that I don't think Americans would commonly use that term. It just doesn't
Yeah.
sound part of our lexicon.
Yeah. I mean, there was a there's a folk band. This is when I say folk band, they kind of follow what we in England, when people use the word folk music, they tend to refer. That's another one. I hadn't thought of that. In England, when people use the word folk music, what they mean is traditional music, generally speaking.
In the
It,
US, if you were to say folk music, you're thinking more like like a lot of acoustic guitar, a lot of vocals,
hmm
more like
Bob Dylan.
Apple, yeah, Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
Appalachia, like not country. It's not country,
No,
but
no,
it's a
no, no.
lot more like kind of folksy. I don't know, like
Yeah.
like
It's
not traditional. I don't think it
yes.
follows traditional. It's its own kind of style of music.
Yeah. Whereas in Britain, actually, when somebody says folk band, that refers to traditional music, generally speaking. And there are some arguments about whether one band is more folksy than another, or folky than another. I mean, folk music in Britain has changed quite a lot recently, but yeah. But the thing is that there was a traditional band who had a tune called "Dodgy Bastards."
That's a
It's a good tune as
great
well.
name.
Yeah, it's worth looking up. The band called Steel Eye Spat, and they've been around for years. But they did have a tune called "Dodgy Bastards."
I love
No
it.
vocals, but yeah, it's a good tune as well.
That sounds awesome. Oh, isn't that a thing in the UK? I could be wrong, but is that a thing for a while where it was like you would say tune, and that was a way of saying like, oh, that's a good song? Am I wrong?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
that is
we
true.
would never say that in the US.
I was
Never.
shocked. I was surprised when people did it as well. I was just like, I'd never heard it before. Being outside the UK and you come back and people go, "Oh, tune." You're like, fair enough.
Because for us, if you say like, oh, that's a, like if you use just the word tune, that's closer to like cartoon. So like Looney Tunes, a cartoon, like
Okay, yeah,
something
yeah.
is toony, or it's like it's a tune. It's a more of a way of referring to like a cartoon rather than music.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah,
interesting,
yeah.
right? I just thought of that because I remember watching, I think it was no, Big Fat Quiz of the Year, and they were talking
Okay.
about how people were saying like, tune. And I was like, why would you say that? Like, that sounds so weird.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't heard it for a while. I don't think many. I haven't heard it for a while, but then maybe I'm just not mixing in circles of people that say it anymore. I mean, maybe it's gone out of fashion.
Yeah, well, also
I haven't.
slang also changes all the time. That's
Yeah,
a thing with
exactly.
it. Okay, I have a big one. This is a big one, especially for people who are fans of baking or who are fans of Great British Bake Off, which is like the best phenomenon out of English TV. I'm sorry, I will stand by that. I love Great British Bake Off. I think it's one of the best shows that has ever been created by the UK.
Is Sandy Toksvig on it and Neil Fielding? They're both on it still, aren't
They're
they?
on it, yeah. They're
Yeah.
the like hosts for this
Yeah.
season, and they have been so wonderful. I really like them. I'm a fan.
Oh,
Anyway,
Sandy Toksvig is
oh no,
probably going to end up
Sandy
being a
was
national
not.
treasure.
Sorry, Sandy was not on this season.
Oh.
Due to I think it was multiple reasons, but also because of quarantine, and she was doing a lot of projects. She decided to step out, and instead they have someone else. And I'm blanking on his name. I'm going to look it up because it's going to drive me crazy. It's Noel Fielding and Matt Lucas. They've been the
When
hosts
was
for
the
this
last
past
time?
season.
When was the last time I saw anything by Matt Lucas? I can't remember.
He's lovely in it.
Oh no,
He's
yeah,
really
'cause
great.
yeah, I can remember that he was in Doctor Who. There's the last sort of thing, and he's also been all over the place. Little Britain is famous for in England
Oh, okay.
or in the UK
So
with David Walliams. Oh yeah, David Walliams swam the channel.
yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are different terms that we use
Yeah.
in the States when it comes to certain baking things. So in the UK, what you would refer to as a scone, we would call a
Yeah.
biscuit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a fluffy inside. It rises, usually has a lot of butter in it. It's a very simple
Yeah.
bake. And then what in the UK you would call a biscuit, we in the States would call a cookie.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, biscuits in the UK, can those also be savory? Or are they only sweet? Like if someone offered you a
Oh
biscuit,
yeah, they could be savoury. Yeah,
they
they
could be savory too. Okay, so in the States,
So,
cookies
like,
are
you have,
only
like-
sweet.
Yeah, because I mean, in Britain you have you refer to having cheese and biscuits.
Oh,
It's like-
interesting.
It's something that you call it a cracker.
Yes, we would specifically call a savory, like a savory version of a cookie. Yeah, it would be a cracker.
A cracker.
Um,
We refer to it as cheese and crackers or cheese and biscuits. It's either or is interchangeable. What are there? There's a famous kind of biscuit, and I cannot remember what it's called. It'll probably come back to me.
what,
I'll
in the
probably shout it
US
out in a
or in
second.
the UK?
No, in the UK, there's a particular kind of biscuit that's
Jammy Dodgers?
No, not Jammy Dodgers. But there's one that's eaten specifically with cheese, and I cannot remember its name.
Oh, we have so many different types. There's like Ritz, there's Triscuits, there's water crackers. There's like so many different crackers you can have with cheese that are amazing. I won't
There are
get
some
into
really
it.
good ones.
But cookies in the States are anything that are sweet and that bake out into like more of a flatter,
Yes.
they're not as doughy. They're a lot more crisp. Like cookies, when I think of a cookie, they can be softer, but they usually have, at least on the bottom, more of a solid crunch bake. And then maybe the middle is a little gooey.
Yeah.
But I thought that was so interesting because, I looked into it a little bit more. I was curious, like, why did we stay away from the term biscuit? Why did we stay away from the term scones? Things like that. And it turned out that when we came from the UK to the US, there were certain terms that we were trying to stay away from, and that was used as like anti-propaganda. And apparently biscuit was one of those terms where we were like, absolutely not. This is a UK term. We are not using it. And so we started using the term cookie, which kind of has a similarity to biscuit because biscuit comes from the Italian double baked, biscotti. So to double bake something, twice baked. And so cookie, the idea is like it's cooked. So the same kind of idea of like the cooking process. But then eventually later on, after the Revolutionary War and everything, time had passed. And I guess collectively as a nation, we were like, yeah, we can use biscuit again. But by that time, we had already used biscuit for a very specific item. And so we started changing the idea of like what the UK's people in the UK would call a scone. We started calling them biscuits.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And then like what in the UK is called a muffin, we in the States call an English muffin, because a muffin in the US is very specifically those things that are baked in a muffin tin they have a little bit of a divot in them. You put paper around it, and then it usually creates like a top, kind of almost like a mushroom. It looks like a fat mushroom. Always usually sweet, although I have seen savory muffins. And they're closer in texture to almost a cake. Not exactly. They usually have a little bit more density than a cake, but a muffin is a little bit closer to that. Whereas an English muffin, what in the UK you call a muffin, is more like a flat, very aerated on the inside, baked on both sides, usually on a griddle. But it's not a pancake. It's very specifically not a pancake. And then I went into another rabbit hole where I was curious because in the US we have a lot of terms for pancakes. One of them being flapjacks. The UK, flapjacks are not pancakes.
Flapjack is a very specific thing. It's basically oats. So the same stuff you would make oatmeal with.
Like a granola bar?
It isn't even that. It's not like that. It's softer. It's usually made using butter and sugar.
Ooh.
That's how it's done. And you do bake it in an oven. And it's very sweet. And you can do things like, you can have like a jam base and things like that. It tastes very much like a granola bar. I would say that that's true, but it's softer.
That sounds
doesn't crunch.
so good.
It's much easier to eat.
I'm not gonna lie, that sounds so amazing. That sounds so good to me right now. But yeah, no, I thought that was interesting because in the States we have so many terms for pancakes. Like there's pancakes, there's hot cake. Well, hot cakes are their own thing. There's flapjacks. We have a bunch of different terms for them. So I thought that was interesting that when flapjacks popped up in the UK, it was like this is a whole other thing. Like it's nothing to do with pancakes. So yeah, just a couple of like things. Another one that I found was what in the UK would be called a pastry. In the US, we would call a turnover. Like we have pastries in the States, of course, but it's more of a category. In the States, pastries would be like a croissant, like a Danish pastry, like anything that's kind of flaky, buttery, and that's sweet and considered more like decadent. But in the UK, at least from what I was looking up, it sounded like the term pastry specifically refers to what we in the States would call a turnover, which has like fillings on the inside, and then you fold this like almost like a puff pastry or a rough puff pastry around it, and it has sugar on the sides. It's not a specific thing. In the US, pastry is a whole category. Turnover is like a very specific item.
Yeah, I mean, we do have things like we do refer to them as turnovers to an extent. Pasty.
Pasty. Sorry, pasty.
Pasty. Ah, okay.
I'm sorry. I can't read my handwriting. No, I was like, what am I going into? No, a pasty in the UK is what we call in the States a turnover.
Okay, because like a pasty is often in Britain when we refer to a pasty, we often refer to it's actually it'll be savoury.
Oh, okay.
So, you have, the story goes that basically, because particularly one of the big ideas is the Cornish pasty. And the idea is that what you would do is that it was for miners. And I'm not sure what they were mining. It probably being from Cornwall would mostly have been tin, probably a bit of coal. Cornwall had a lot of tin. Did they have tin was the big one, I think. But the story goes that basically it's because the miners would be down there and their hands would be dirty.
Mm-hmm.
So what they would do is they make the pastry, the pasty, and put everything in it, fold it up and bake it. And then what you would do is you would have the pasty with you break it open and then eat what was inside the pasty and leave the pastry.
So you wouldn't eat the pastry at all?
That's how the story goes.
Oh, interesting.
It's to prevent you from getting, dirt in your food. If you're a miner, it's a big deal.
Yeah, I would think so. That's so interesting. That's a new one for me. I kind of like that. Man, if I could
I have no idea
read
if it's
my
true,
handwriting.
but that's how the story goes.
Oh my gosh.
It's fine.
I do have one more like food related one, which is very common, like the whole chips fries versus crisps and chips. So like in the US, chips are referred to what in the UK would be crisps. It's the very thin potato that is fried, although chips have now grown as a whole category in the States where there's like corn chips, there's potato chips, there's flour chips, like there's a whole thing. Whereas in the UK, a chip is more what we in the States would call a fry. So it's potatoes that are cut in wedges and then fried. They're cut thicker, so it's a French fry, like what we in the States would call a French fry. And that's why there's a whole like dish that's built out of it, fish and chips. Very famous.
Created by Jewish people in Victorian London.
Oh,
they came from Spain.
Totally makes sense. That totally makes sense.
That's who invented it, which is quite cool. That's what I've heard. I don't actually know if it's entirely true, but that's what I've heard. Person generally is pretty reliable that I got it from. I think he's called Jonathan Meads, but this is something like 10, 15 years ago, or probably longer ago, so it might have been, maybe somebody else has found something else out. But yeah, it's Jewish people leaving Spain, coming to Britain and invented fish and chips.
I love fish and chips.
So the story goes.
That's
and apparently the best thing to do.
Meal.
Yeah, it's good fun. Apparently the best thing to do to make sure you get it right is you have to fry it in vegetable oil, because vegetable oil can reach a higher temperature than animal fat.
Yep.
That's the secret.
And it doesn't impart like too much flavor with a fish. A lot of the times they're fairly fragile in flavor, so imparting too much animal fat might like kind of kill the fish in flavor. Like it won't kill the texture, but I'm saying like
in live. It's
no,
all right.
They're not putting it live. But yeah, isn't it true? Okay, I could be wrong, but is it true that in the UK, if you brought your own like fish, they'll fry it for you?
I've never heard of anybody doing that.
Interesting.
Probably food laws prevent people from doing that now, but I mean,
true.
I can give it a go.
Go to your local chip shop and be like, I have this fish. Will you fry it for me?
Yeah.
Can you please do that and report back and tell us how it goes?
I'll give it a go. I mean, they do have deep fried Mars bars.
Oh God, that's a thing that they do
exist.
here in the States.
It exists.
Yeah, there's like the state fair. I can't remember which state, but they had for a while. They were doing like fried butter, fried ice cream, fried Snickers bars, fried Oreos, like everything fried. I have had fried Oreos, and those are good, I will say.
Isn't there a Japanese thing where they kind of do a fried ice cream?
Yes, it's really good.
Yes, it exists.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not actually such a bad idea.
It is a good idea.
That
You
makes
just have to
sense.
get that ice cream like real cold. Like really cold to make it work, because otherwise you're just going to get melted ice cream in your oil, which sounds gross. Ew.
Yeah. How would you get it out?
Oh God, I don't even want to think about that.
It would burn before you could do anything about it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, basically.
No.
Oh my gosh, we're already out of time. This is so much fun. I love this. This is like one of my favorite things to get into because, even though we both speak English, the language, we do use a lot of terms that are very different.
Oh, yeah.
From like historical perspectives. We also use terms that have changed over time, that have changed meaning over time. So this is definitely not the last episode that we're going to do on this because it's so much fun. There's so many interesting terms that we can get into.
We could even do it region by region within the countries that we're in.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, in the South, there are terms that you would never use in the North. You would never use on the West Coast. Like
y'all.
Oh yeah, like I use y'all all the time. And living in the North, I live in Buffalo now. I originally came from Louisiana, and I would have people who constantly I would use y'all when I was working in the service industry, and it'd be like, where are you from? Why are you using y'all? I'm like, I'm originally from Louisiana. And then they're like, well, you have no accent. I'm like, well, I left. So what do you want? Like, stop arguing with me. I'm trying to give you food.
Do you want the fish and chips or not? Just.
Oh my gosh. Yes, exactly. We are definitely going to get into more topics as we go along. This is a really fun one. But until then, I think that's kind of it for today.
Yeah.
So we have a Twitter. Please check out our Twitter. It's at PassportNess1. So that's PassportNecess1. It's also in our description. I made sure to add it. If you have been enjoying our podcast, please leave a review or a comment. We absolutely love it. We will read every single one. If you have any questions, reach out to us on Twitter so that we could potentially use it in one of our future episodes. And we do have some interviews coming up in the near future, so definitely check out that.
Yes.
And that's kind of it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Have a great day.
Right. Thank you.
Bye, Marcus.
Bye.